When wealth chooses abandonment, fate intervenes with a startling awakening. In a private hospital wing, medical documents reveal a truth that transforms a simple inheritance into an epic of justice. Between the cold halls of privilege and the warmth of redemption lies a story of awakening consciousness and shocking revelations. As legal papers emerge, the true value of loyalty becomes clear. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent floral arrangements adorning Elias Thorne's private hospital room. Sunlight, filtered through sheer curtains, cast a pale glow on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the dark circles under his eyes. He stared blankly at the ceiling, the weight of his newly acquired inheritance pressing down on him like a physical burden. The vast fortune felt less like a blessing and more like a poison chalice. "Mr. Thorne." Dr. Anya Sharma's voice was soft, laced with concern. She entered the room, her presence a calming balm in the sterile environment. Her eyes, warm and empathetic, held a depth that transcended the professional. Elias shifted, a sigh escaping his lips. "It's overwhelming," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "The guilt, it's suffocating." Anya sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "Tell me about it," she urged, her voice a gentle whisper. He recounted his childhood, the coldness of his adoptive parents' mansion, the echoing emptiness of vast, ornate rooms, the persistent sense of being an outsider looking in. His voice cracked as he spoke of their disdain, their veiled cruelty masked by a facade of polite indifference. "They never wanted me," he whispered, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I was an inconvenience, a stain on their perfect image." Anya listened patiently, her presence a beacon of understanding in the storm of his emotions. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. Then, she spoke, her voice measured. "There are inconsistencies in your medical records, Elias. Inconsistencies that suggest a different story." The words hung in the air, a seed of hope planted in the barren landscape of his despair. A flicker of curiosity sparked in his eyes, a crack in the wall of grief. The weight of guilt remained, but it was now laced with a nascent thread of something else. Anticipation. The revelation of a different story, a story that might explain the gaping hole in his heart, ignited a spark of hope, promising an answer to the lingering questions that haunted his every waking moment. The hushed reverence of the hospital wing was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. Sunlight, pale and weak, struggled to pierce the heavy drapes, casting long shadows across the room. Elias traced the patterns with a trembling finger, the cool cotton sheets a stark contrast to the burning ache in his chest. Anya's words echoed in his mind. "Inconsistencies in your medical records." He picked up the worn photograph from his bedside table, a grainy image of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a man with a gentle, familiar face. He didn't remember them, but a strange pull, a primal recognition, tugged at his heart. These weren't the cold, distant figures that populated his fractured memories. "They look like they loved you," he whispered, more to himself than to Anya, who was carefully reviewing a file. The rustle of paper was almost inaudible in the quiet room. Anya looked up, her gaze compassionate, but her expression was serious. "Elias," she began, her voice soft but firm, "there's a possibility your adoption wasn't entirely above board. This file," she hesitated, running a finger down a page, "indicates a deliberate cover-up. Your birth certificate, it's been altered." A cold dread tightened its grip around his heart. The subtle hints Silas had dropped, the evasive answers, now coalesced into a horrifying truth. He felt a dizzying rush of emotions, betrayal, anger, a deep, gnawing sense of injustice. Years of suppressed hurt surged to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. He stood abruptly, the movement causing a sharp pain in his side. He ignored it, pacing restlessly. "They lied to me," he breathed, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. The polished floor seemed to gleam with a malevolent light, mirroring the darkness swirling inside him. The gilded cage of his privileged upbringing now felt like a prison, its walls closing in. Anya rose to her feet, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "I know this is hard," she said softly, "but you're not alone. We'll uncover the truth, Elias. Together." Her touch was a lifeline, anchoring him to the present, to the glimmer of hope that dared to bloom in the heart of his despair. The fight had begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark counterpoint to the swirling chaos in Elias's mind. He stared at the photograph, the woman's smile a haunting echo of a love he'd never known. Anya's words, deliberate cover-up, hung between them like a poisoned dart. The weight of betrayal pressed down, crushing the fragile hope that had blossomed just moments before. It doesn't make sense," he stammered, his voice raw with disbelief. The polished floor, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, felt cold beneath his bare feet. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture jerky and uncontrolled. Anya watched him, her expression a blend of sympathy and determination. The file lay open on the table, a testament to the carefully constructed lies that had shaped his life. She understood the depth of his pain, the years of emotional neglect masquerading as privilege. "It will," she said quietly, her voice a soothing balm against the storm raging within him. "We'll find out why. We'll find your family." He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing past the professional compassion to the genuine concern in her eyes. Her presence, a quiet strength in the face of overwhelming darkness, was a lifeline. The anger, though still simmering, began to give way to a desperate need for answers, for understanding. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the cool cotton a stark contrast to the fire burning within him. "Silas, he knew," he whispered, the words laced with a mixture of accusation and despair. The lawyer's evasiveness, once dismissed as eccentricity, now took on a sinister meaning. The fragmented truths, the carefully veiled hints, were pieces of a deliberate puzzle designed to keep him trapped in ignorance. Anya nodded slowly. "He's a key to this, Elias, but we need more than his word. We need proof." She tapped a finger on the altered birth certificate. "This is just the beginning." The quiet confidence in her voice, the unwavering belief in the possibility of justice, sparked a flicker of hope within him. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of antiseptic suddenly less oppressive, less suffocating. The fight wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't alone. He had Anya, and the burning desire to uncover the truth, to reclaim his identity and find the family history stolen from him. The gilded cage, though still firmly in place, felt slightly less confining. The bars, he realized, could be broken. The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to amplify the tremor in Elias's hands as he reread the doctor's notes. Each word, a carefully chosen syllable, felt like a tiny hammer blow against the fragile construct of his life. The cool cotton sheets offered little comfort against the icy dread creeping into his bones. He could practically taste the metallic tang of fear, a bitter aftertaste to the initial shock. Anya sat across from him, her gaze unwavering, yet filled with a quiet empathy that warmed him despite the chill in the air. "They knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. The accusation hung between them, unspoken yet palpable. The revelation that his abandonment wasn't an accident, but a deliberate act, was a blow harder than any physical assault. Anya nodded, the movement slight, almost imperceptible. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a relentless reminder of time lost, of a life stolen. He watched her, searching her eyes for some shred of reassurance, some hint of an escape from this suffocating truth. He closed his eyes, the images flooding back. The cold, echoing hallways of the opulent Thorne mansion, the distant whispers of servants, the chilling absence of warmth or affection. The memory of a small hand reaching out, grasping at an intangible love that was never there, brought tears to his eyes. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. The years of carefully constructed denial crumbled under the weight of this newfound reality. "What do we do now?" he finally asked, his voice rough with unshed tears. The question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty and a burgeoning anger that was slowly beginning to displace the paralysis of fear. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as he brought it to his lips. The cool liquid did little to quench the burning thirst for justice that was beginning to consume him. Anya's hand covered his, her touch gentle but firm. "We find the truth, Elias," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "We find your family, and we make them pay for what they've done." The quiet determination in her tone, the unwavering support, ignited a spark within him, a flicker of hope against the encroaching darkness. The fight had begun and he was ready. The gilded cage still held him, but the bars, once seemingly impenetrable, now felt fragile, vulnerable. The fight for his identity, his past, his very soul had just begun. The mahogany desk in Silas Blackwood's office felt cold beneath Elias's fingertips. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the gloom, each particle a tiny speck of the lawyer's carefully constructed lies. Silas, usually impeccably groomed, sat hunched, his starched collar straining against his visibly trembling neck. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, clinging to Elias like a shroud. The Thorne family, they weren't entirely forthcoming, Silas mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The admission hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Elias leaned forward, the weight of Anya's words. "We find the truth, Elias. We find your family, and we make them pay," fueling his resolve. Forthcoming about what, Silas? My abandonment? My medical records? He felt a surge of anger, a hot, searing wave threatening to consume him. The controlled fury he'd maintained since discovering the truth in the hospital was fraying at the edges. Silas avoided his gaze. There were complications, circumstances best left buried. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. "It was a dark time, Mr. Thorne, a time of difficult choices. Difficult choices that cost me my family?" Elias's voice rose, sharp and brittle, cracking under the strain of years of suppressed emotions. The years of loneliness and uncertainty clawed at him. He saw his small self again, alone, lost, a shadow reaching for a love he never received. Silas shifted in his chair, the leather creaking a mournful counterpoint to Elias's inner turmoil. He pushed a manila folder across the desk, the gesture stiff and hesitant. This might shed some light. I couldn't keep it hidden any longer. My conscience." His voice trailed off, lost in a welter of guilt and fear. Elias snatched the folder, his fingers brushing against Silas's. The lawyer's hand was clammy and cold. The touch, a brief physical connection, was a jarring reminder of the cold, calculated cruelty that had shaped Elias's life. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed legal documents, was a photograph. A small child, his younger self, staring out from a faded frame with wide, innocent eyes. The image struck Elias with the force of a physical blow, a tangible manifestation of a past he desperately tried to forget. The accompanying documents revealed a systematic cover-up, a deliberate campaign of deception orchestrated by his adoptive family. The weight of the betrayal was crushing, yet strangely, a new feeling ignited within him. The fierce, burning ember of hope, the truth finally revealed, felt like a weapon, sharp and potent. The fight for justice had truly begun. The photograph seared itself onto Elias's memory. A younger him, eyes wide with a naive trust that had been brutally betrayed. The manila folder, heavy with the weight of decades of lies, felt like a physical burden in his hands. He looked up, the cold, sterile light of Silas Blackwood's office highlighting the tremor in the lawyer's hands. Silas's guilt was palpable, a suffocating miasma clinging to the air thick with the scent of old paper and regret. They feared scandal, Silas whispered, his voice raspy, barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock. The Thorn name, its reputation, everything was at stake. Elias felt a cold rage begin to simmer. The carefully constructed facade of respectability, the gilded cage of his privileged upbringing, crumbled before the stark reality of his abandonment. Years of loneliness, of questioning his worth, boiled over. He slammed the folder onto the desk, the sharp sound echoing in the silent room. "Reputation?" he spat, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "What about my reputation? My life? The years stolen from me?" He stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor, a harsh sound that punctuated the silence. Silas flinched, his eyes darting nervously to the door. He looked like a trapped animal, his usually impeccable composure shattered. Elias moved closer, the cold mahogany desk separating them feeling like a chasm. "This wasn't just a difficult choice," Elias pressed, his voice low and dangerous. "This was deliberate cruelty. This was a conspiracy." The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, a physical weight threatening to crush him. Yet, beneath the anger, a flicker of hope ignited. The truth, however brutal, was a weapon. He could feel Anya's presence, her quiet support a tangible comfort despite the physical distance. He pictured her, her concerned gaze, her unwavering belief in him. That image, a counterpoint to the chilling revelation before him, fueled his resolve. The fight for justice had begun, and he would not be silenced. The air in Anya's small, sun-drenched office felt a world away from the sterile chill of Silas Blackwood's chambers. The scent of jasmine tea, a stark contrast to the musty smell of old legal documents, calmed Elias's frayed nerves. He sat opposite Anya, the warmth of her smile a balm to his raw anger. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. "He's terrified?" Anya said softly, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the tempest raging within him. She gestured towards a mug of tea, her hand resting lightly on the worn wooden table. "Silas, he knows the truth will unravel everything." Elias ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the depth of his exhaustion. He tried to minimize it, to justify it as a difficult choice, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. The memory of Silas's trembling hands, his evasive gaze, was still vivid. A difficult choice? My entire life was erased by their difficult choice. Anya's gaze was filled with empathy, a silent understanding that transcended words. She reached across the table, her fingers gently brushing his. The simple touch sparked a wave of unexpected comfort, a lifeline in the churning sea of his emotions. "They chose to protect their reputation over a child's life," she said, her voice firm, laced with righteous anger. "And you, Elias, you deserve justice." Her words resonated, striking a chord deep within him. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his stolen identity, his stolen years. Elias nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation settling upon him. He felt a shift within, a hardening of resolve. The simmering rage began to transform into a focused energy, a burning desire for truth and justice. He took a deep breath, the jasmine tea's subtle sweetness momentarily calming the bitter taste in his mouth. "I need to find them," he said, his voice low but determined. "My biological family. I need to know who they are." The thought ignited a spark of hope amidst the darkness, a beacon in the storm of his tumultuous emotions. The fight for justice was just beginning, but for the first time Elias felt a surge of power, a strength drawn not from his inheritance, but from the unwavering support of a woman who believed in him and the burning desire to reclaim his stolen past. The gilded cage might have held him captive for years, but the key to freedom was finally in his hand. The scent of antiseptic clung to Elias's clothes, a stark reminder of the sterile environment he'd just left. He walked, head down, the city's cacophony a jarring contrast to the hushed silence of the hospital wing. Rain slicked the pavements, mirroring the turmoil within him. Anya's words echoed. They chose to protect their reputation over a child's life. The injustice gnawed at him, a constant, bitter ache. He reached his apartment, a lavish space that felt increasingly alien. The opulent furnishings mocked his inner turmoil. He sank onto the plush sofa, the soft cushions offering little comfort. He picked up a framed photograph, a stiff, formal portrait of his adoptive parents, their smiles strained and artificial. A wave of nausea washed over him. The gilded cage, Anya had called it, and the bars felt tighter than ever. His phone buzzed, breaking the suffocating silence. It was Anya. "I found something," she said, her voice hushed, urgent. "A name, a possible lead on your biological family. It's a long shot, but it's something." Hope, fragile but tenacious, flickered within him. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a counterpoint to the exhaustion that had been weighing him down. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. Anya's voice, though soft, held an unwavering strength. "A woman named Isabella Rossi. She lived in Florence. The medical records mention a connection, a possible sibling. The information was scant, fragmented, yet it was a lifeline, a tangible connection to the life stolen from him." Elias felt a knot of anticipation tighten in his stomach. Florence. The name conjured images of sun-drenched squares, ancient bridges spanning the Arno, a world away from the cold, sterile reality of his existence. He pictured himself walking cobblestone streets, searching for answers, for a family he never knew. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was more than just an inheritance. It was a quest for identity, a journey to reclaim his stolen past. The fight for justice was becoming a pilgrimage of self-discovery. The rain hammered against the taxi window, blurring the city lights into shimmering streaks. Inside, Elias stared out, the city's frantic energy a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil within him. Anya's words, Isabella Rossi, Florence, echoed in his head, a fragile seed of hope taking root in the barren soil of his despair. He clutched the crumpled piece of paper containing the name, the texture rough against his trembling fingers. The scent of old paper and Anya's perfume, a faint, floral undercurrent, clung to it, a tangible link to her unwavering support. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Florence felt impossibly distant, a world away from the sterile confines of the private hospital wing and the suffocating opulence of his apartment. Yet, it was also a beacon, a potential path out of the gilded cage. The taxi pulled up to his building, the sudden stop jarring him back to the present. He paid the driver, his movements automatic, his mind already miles away, traversing cobblestone streets in his imagination. He entered his apartment, the lavish space feeling even more alien than before. The expensive artwork seemed to mock him, their vibrant colors clashing with the grayscale of his emotions. He moved towards his study, the only room that felt remotely like his own, a sanctuary amidst the gilded excess. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a tiny hammer against his window panes, a rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of his heart. He sat at his desk, the polished wood cold beneath his fingertips. He opened his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. He began researching Isabella Rossi, his fingers flying across the keyboard, each keystroke a step closer to a past he never knew. His breathing grew shallow as a search engine result returned a picture, an old, faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A wave of emotion washed over him, a yearning for connection, a desperate longing for belonging. He found a local historian in Florence, a certain Professor Lorenzo, mentioned in a journal article. He typed a hesitant email, explaining his situation, the inheritance, the discovery, the desperate search for his roots. The click of the send button felt momentous, a leap into the unknown. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future pressing down on him. But hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered within him, a testament to Anya's faith in him and his own burgeoning determination to find his true identity. The rain finally started to ease, a subtle shift in the atmosphere mirroring the subtle shift in his own soul. The stale air of the hospital room clung to Elias like a second skin. He stared at the faded photograph, the woman's smile a ghost of warmth against the stark white of the paper. Anya entered, the scent of antiseptic momentarily battling the faint perfume clinging to the photo. "Anything?" she asked softly, her voice a balm to his frayed nerves. Elias shook his head, the movement causing a dull ache in his temples. Professor Lorenzo hasn't replied. It feels hopeless. The weight of his newfound inheritance pressed down on him, a gilded cage he desperately wanted to escape. Anya sat beside him, her hand gently covering his. "It's only been a day, Elias. Give it time. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon." Her empathy was a lifeline he was desperately clinging to. He looked at her, his eyes mirroring the storm raging within. What if there's nothing? What if this whole search is pointless? The fear clawed at him, a cold, icy grip tightening around his heart. Anya squeezed his hand. "Then we'll face it together. But I have a feeling, a strong feeling, that this isn't the end." Remember Silas's hesitant words? The other family? There's more to this than meets the eye. She rose, going to the window, the city a blurred tapestry of lights below. "Think of it as a puzzle, Elias. We have a few pieces. Now we need to find the rest." He nodded, a small spark of hope flickering within the suffocating darkness. The mention of Silas's evasiveness reignited a simmering anger. He thought of the lawyer's nervous tics, the carefully crafted lies, the concealed truths. The puzzle wasn't just about his biological family. It was about uncovering a web of deceit that had spanned decades. This wasn't just about finding his past. It was about exposing the truth and seeking justice. The weight on his chest eased slightly, replaced by a surge of resolve. He looked back at the photograph, the woman's smile no longer a ghost, but a promise. A promise of a family, of belonging, of a life he could finally claim as his own. The fight had just begun, but for the first time, Elias felt he wasn't alone. He had Anya, and he had hope. The rain outside had stopped. A pale moon shone through the window, casting a soft glow on Anya's face, a beacon in his uncertain future. The mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Silas Blackwood's office. Elias sat opposite him, the scent of old leather and expensive cigars heavy in the air. Silas, usually impeccably groomed, looked disheveled, his normally slicked-back hair askew. He avoided eye contact, nervously twisting a silver pen between his fingers. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I found something," Silas finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He pushed a file across the polished desk. The embossed Thorne family crest seemed to mock Elias's growing unease. He opened it, his fingers trembling slightly. The documents were meticulously typed, detailing financial transactions, coded entries, and dates stretching back decades. A cold dread tightened in his chest. This shows systematic transfers of funds," Elias stated, his voice low and controlled, masking the turmoil within. "Large sums, diverted, hidden." Silas flinched. "It's complicated, Elias. A matter of family complexities." His voice cracked. He looked up, his eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and regret. "I've kept this from you, from everyone, for so long. It's been a burden." The weight of his adoptive family's deception pressed down on Elias, a crushing weight of betrayal. He felt the familiar sting of abandonment, the hollow ache in his heart that had haunted him since childhood. He slammed the file shut, the sound echoing in the silent room. "A burden," Elias repeated, his voice edged with icy anger. "My entire life has been a burden to them. My existence, a shameful secret they buried under layers of lies and wealth." He rose, the chair scraping against the floor. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations and decades of suppressed truth. Silas watched him, his face pale and drawn. "There's more," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Much more. About your biological family. The truth is far more intricate than you can imagine." A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. The weight of his confession, the decades of carefully constructed lies crumbling around him, finally broke through his defenses. Elias watched, a flicker of understanding, a hesitant spark of forgiveness, beginning to replace the consuming rage. The fight for justice had begun, but the journey toward understanding, and perhaps even healing, was just starting. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of Anya's office. Sunlight, filtered through the blinds, cast long shadows across the polished desk. Elias sat opposite her, the newly inherited Thorn fortune a distant, irrelevant weight. He traced the rim of his coffee cup, the swirling liquid mirroring the turmoil within him. Silas's revelations had cracked open a chasm in his life, exposing a darkness he'd never suspected. The inconsistencies, they're not just medical errors, Anya said softly, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm raging inside him. She pushed a file across the desk, the crisp pages whispering a story of deliberate omission and calculated deceit. These records suggest a deliberate attempt to conceal your true origins. Elias's hand trembled as he unfolded the papers. Photographs, medical reports, birth certificates, each document a brick in a wall of carefully constructed lies. He recognized his own features, younger, softer, but undeniably his, alongside a woman he'd never known, her smile radiating a warmth that was both captivating and heartbreaking. A woman whose love he'd never received. My mother," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The coffee cup slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the polished floor. The sound, sharp and sudden, seemed to break the dam of his carefully controlled grief. Anya rose, her hand gently resting on his arm. He looked up at her, tears blurring his vision. Her empathy was a lifeline, a beacon in the suffocating darkness of his newly discovered past. He saw not just a doctor but a friend, a confidant, someone who understood the crushing weight of his revelation. "It's going to be all right," she murmured, her voice laced with concern, a promise whispered against the backdrop of his pain. "We'll find the truth, Elias. Together." Her words were a lifeline, a subtle shift in their professional relationship, a tacit acknowledgement of the profound connection forged in the crucible of his newfound reality. The comforting weight of her hand was a powerful reassurance. The fight for justice, for his stolen heritage, for the truth of his existence, began, not with anger, but with a quiet, determined resolve born out of the warmth of newfound understanding. The mahogany table in Silas Blackwood's office felt cold beneath Elias's trembling hands. The scent of aged leather and pipe tobacco clung to the air, a cloying perfume of secrets. Silas, his face etched with a weariness that hinted at years of carefully guarded lies, shuffled papers, his usually crisp attire rumpled. The flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows, transforming the room into a stage for a performance Elias hadn't asked to witness. "Your parentage, Mr. Thorne," Silas began, his voice a low rasp, "is complicated." He avoided Elias's gaze, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The carefully constructed facade of the unflappable lawyer was crumbling. Elias felt a surge of icy dread. He knew, instinctively, that this wasn't merely a matter of an estranged family. This was something far more sinister. The guilt he'd initially felt over his family's rejection now transformed into a burgeoning suspicion, a chilling premonition. Complicated how? Elias pressed, his voice tight with barely contained anger. The tremor in his hands betrayed the composure he desperately tried to maintain. The weight of the Thorne fortune, once a symbol of sudden wealth, now felt like a leaden cloak, suffocating him under its burden of unanswered questions. Silas cleared his throat, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He produced a faded photograph, its edges frayed with age. A young woman smiled radiantly, her eyes mirroring a profound sadness Elias found unsettlingly familiar. "This is your mother," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible. The admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Elias stared at the photograph, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a strange kinship with this woman, a profound connection across the chasm of years and silence. A mother he never knew, a love he never experienced. The warmth of Anya's earlier comfort felt miles away. The sterile coldness of Silas's office replaced it. This was the beginning of his unraveling. The fight for justice hadn't begun. It had just become undeniably personal. The photograph felt like a burning brand against Elias's palm. The woman's smile, a fragile bloom against a backdrop of faded sepia, haunted him. Silas's silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the London fog pressing against the hospital windows. Elias felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. "And my father?" Elias's voice was barely a whisper, the words catching on the ragged edges of his rising panic. The mahogany table seemed to loom, a monstrous presence in the dimly lit room. "In Oakhaven," she said, her voice hushed. "Birth certificates, adoption papers, everything points to a deliberate cover-up." Elias's breath hitched. He could barely whisper, My biological family?" Anya nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. There were 2 sets of twins born around the same time, one set adopted by the Thorne family. The records show that the other twins, including your sister, were given away. Their identities changed to protect the Thorne family's reputation. It was a cruel deception. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain. Elias's hand trembled as he reached for the brittle papers. A photograph slipped out, a faded image of 2 young girls, their smiles radiant despite the poverty of their surroundings. One girl bore a striking resemblance to the woman in the picture he carried, Sarah. A wave of nausea washed over him, the full weight of the betrayal hitting him with brutal force. He felt a primal scream building in his chest, a raw, animalistic cry of pain and rage. He wanted to shatter everything, destroy the cold, calculating world that had orchestrated his life. He looked up at Anya, his eyes filled with tears, but it wasn't just sorrow. There was a flicker of something else, a fierce determination, a burning desire for justice. "I need to find them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My sister. I need to find my sister." Anya reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "We'll find them, Elias. Together." The warmth of her touch, the unwavering support in her eyes, helped to steady the tempest within him. He leaned into her touch, finding solace in her presence, a lifeline in the churning sea of his emotions. The rain continued its relentless assault on the window panes, but inside, a new kind of storm was brewing, a storm of hope, fueled by the promise of reunion and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges, but for the first time, Elias felt a glimmer of something akin to peace amidst the turmoil. The fight for justice was far from over, but now it was a fight he would face with renewed purpose, armed with the truth and the unwavering support of a woman who saw beyond his wealth, into the heart of the man he was destined to become. The rain hammered against the hospital window, a relentless percussion accompanying the turmoil in Elias's gut. Anya's words echoed, a cruel symphony of betrayal and deception. He stared at the faded photograph, the young girl's smiles a stark contrast to the icy rage clenching his heart. Sarah's resemblance to one of them was undeniable, a chilling confirmation of a life stolen, a family fragmented. He felt a tremor run through him, not just physical, but a deep, bone-shaking vibration of disbelief. Years of carefully constructed lies, of carefully cultivated distance, shattered like fragile glass. The opulent Thorne mansion, once a symbol of wealth and security, now felt like a gilded cage, its bars forged from deceit. They took everything from me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. The words were laced with a pain so profound it stole the air from his lungs. Anya reached for his hand, her touch a surprisingly steady anchor in the chaos. Her eyes, usually bright and intelligent, held a shadow of sorrow, mirroring his own grief. "They took your birthright, Elias, but they didn't take your spirit." You have strength, a fire I've seen flicker even in your darkest moments." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the concern in her eyes to the unwavering support she offered. It was a lifeline in the storm, a connection he hadn't realized he craved until now. The coldness that had encased him for so long began to crack, replaced by a fragile warmth. "What now?" he asked, his voice still trembling, but the tremor was less one of fear and more of determined resolve. Anya's gaze held his, unwavering. "Now we find your family. We gather evidence, we build a case. We expose their lies." A hint of steel entered her voice. "And we ensure that justice is served." The words were a promise, a battle cry, echoing the fierce determination taking root in his own heart. The fight ahead would be long and arduous, but he was no longer alone. He had Anya, her unwavering loyalty a beacon in the darkness. And he had the truth, a weapon far more potent than any inheritance. The rain outside continued its furious assault, but within the confines of that small hospital room, a different kind of storm was brewing, a storm of justice, fueled by a desperate hope for reunion and redemption. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the lingering aroma of coffee Anya had brewed earlier. Sunlight, fractured by the rain-streaked window, painted shifting patterns across the worn wooden floor. Elias sat hunched, the faded photograph clutched in his hand, 3 young girls, their laughter seemingly frozen in time. He traced Sarah's face, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. The resemblance was uncanny, a painful echo of a life he never knew. "It's her," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. The weight of decades of deceit pressed down on him, a crushing burden. Anya, perched on the edge of the chair, watched him, her heart aching for him. She understood the depth of his pain, the slow, agonizing revelation of a life stolen. "I know," she said softly, her voice a balm to his ravaged spirit. "The medical records confirm it. The DNA evidence is irrefutable." He looked up, his eyes brimming with a mixture of grief and simmering rage. "My own family, they orchestrated this. They abandoned me, and then systematically erased me from their lives." His voice cracked, the raw emotion evident in every syllable. The carefully constructed facade of composure crumbled, leaving behind a raw, vulnerable core. Anya reached out, her fingers gently brushing his. "They didn't win, Elias. You're here. You're alive. And you have the truth." Her touch was a lifeline, a steady reassurance amidst the emotional storm raging within him. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her unwavering support. "But how do I face them? How do I confront the years of lies, the deliberate cruelty?" He looked down at the photo again, the girls' faces blurring through his tears. The thought of facing his adoptive family, of unmasking their elaborate deception, filled him with dread. Yet, a flicker of defiance, of righteous anger, ignited within him. "We start by finding your biological family," Anya said, her voice firm. "Once we have the evidence, we present our case. The truth will prevail. They cannot hide from this forever." Elias nodded, a sense of purpose, however fragile, beginning to take root. The path ahead would be treacherous, fraught with legal battles and emotional upheaval. But the seed of hope had been planted, nurtured by Anya's unwavering belief and the undeniable truth he now held in his hands. The fight for justice had begun. The storm within him was gradually shifting, from despair to a rising tide of righteous anger and determined resolve. The chipped paint on the hospital room's windowsill felt rough beneath Elias's trembling fingers. Rain lashed against the glass, mirroring the storm brewing inside him. Anya's quiet presence was a comforting anchor. He clutched the photograph again, Sarah's face a heartbreaking echo of his own features. They stole my life," he whispered, his voice choked with unshed tears. The sterile scent of the room felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the warmth of Anya's hand covering his. Anya's touch was a lifeline, grounding him in the present. "They took something precious, Elias, but they didn't take your strength," she said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to his turmoil. This isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming your identity, your history. It's about finding your family. The weight of years of deception pressed down on him, a crushing burden of lies. He pictured his adoptive parents, their smiles now twisted into grotesque masks of betrayal. The carefully constructed image of a loving family shattered, replaced by a cold, calculated scheme of manipulation. He saw them again, not as the parents he'd known, but as architects of his isolation, his pain. "I don't know if I can face them," he admitted, his voice barely a breath. The fear was palpable, a chilling tremor in his usually steady voice. The thought of confronting them, of revealing their carefully constructed lie, was paralyzing. Anya squeezed his hand. "You don't have to face them alone. We'll build a case solid and undeniable. We'll find your biological family, and together, we'll show them the consequences of their actions." Her words, though firm, held an underlying tenderness, a quiet strength that resonated deep within him. He needed that strength. He needed her. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the concern in her eyes, to the unwavering support, the quiet determination that burned within her. A flicker of hope ignited within him, a fragile flame against the darkness of his past. He had the truth. He had Anya, and he would fight. The rage, though still simmering, was beginning to temper with a burgeoning sense of purpose, a cold fire of righteous anger fueling his resolve. The fight had truly begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of the old photograph Elias held. Sarah's face, a mirror image of his own, smiled back at him, a ghost from a life he'd never known. Tears welled, blurring the faded ink of the accompanying medical records Anya had unearthed. They detailed a deliberate switch at birth, a conspiracy woven from ambition and greed. They callously discarded me," Elias whispered, his voice raw with pain. The rain outside hammered against the window panes, a relentless percussion accompanying the turmoil within him. Anya's hand rested gently on his, her touch a silent promise of support. "They didn't discard your worth, Elias. They discarded their own humanity." Her voice was soft but firm, a beacon in the storm raging inside him. He traced the lines of Sarah's face in the photograph, his thumb brushing against the worn paper. The weight of years of deception, of a fabricated identity, pressed down on him. The luxurious surroundings of the private hospital felt like a gilded cage, a mockery of the love he'd been denied. "I feel hollowed out," he confessed, his voice barely a murmur. "Like there's a gaping hole where my past should be." Anya squeezed his hand. "That hole will be filled, Elias. With truth, with family, with belonging. We'll find your biological family. We have the evidence, the medical records are irrefutable." She stood, her movement graceful, efficient. "We need to act quickly. Silas is frantic. He's trying to cover his tracks." The mention of Silas, the family lawyer whose carefully constructed facade had crumbled, sparked a new wave of anger. Elias clenched his jaw, the lines of his face hardening. The rage, once a simmering ember, now burned with a fierce, righteous flame. He would not be silenced. He would not be a victim any longer. "He'll pay," Elias vowed, his voice low and dangerous. The fear still lingered, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of purpose, a fierce determination to uncover the full extent of his family's deceit. He would fight for his stolen past, for his rightful identity, for the family he'd never known. The fight for justice had begun, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. The following morning, the sterile white of Anya's office felt less clinical, more like a sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Elias, however, felt anything but serene. The weight of his discovery pressed down, a physical burden. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. "I've contacted a specialist in genealogical research," Anya said, her voice calm, a counterpoint to the storm brewing within him. "They should be able to trace your biological family quickly, given the medical records." Elias nodded, the movement slight, almost imperceptible. He picked at a loose thread on his expensive suit, the fabric feeling alien against his skin. The luxury felt like a cruel joke, a stark reminder of the life he'd been denied. "And Silas?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "He's evasive," Anya replied, her expression serious. "He's hired a high-powered lawyer. This is going to be a battle, Elias." A chill ran down his spine, a premonition of the fight ahead. The legal battle, the media frenzy, it all loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to anchor himself in the present. He saw Sarah's face again, the ghost of a smile, a promise of a connection he'd never known. "I won't let him win," Elias stated, his voice regaining its strength. He met Anya's gaze, his eyes resolute. "I won't let them win. I deserve to know my truth." A small spark of hope flickered within him, a tiny ember in the vast darkness of his past. The fight for justice, for his identity, felt less like a burden and more like a sacred mission. Anya's smile, soft and encouraging, was a comforting warmth in the chill of his apprehension. The path ahead was daunting, but he would walk it, with Anya by his side. The fight had begun and he was ready. The mahogany table in the lawyer's office felt cold beneath Elias's fingertips. The scent of old leather and expensive polish did little to mask the underlying tension. Silas Blackwood, his face etched with a weariness that bordered on despair, sat opposite him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. "The documents, Anya's right, aren't they?" Elias's voice was low, controlled, yet the tremor in his hands betrayed his inner turmoil. The weight of the past, of the lies, pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket. Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He avoided Elias's gaze, his eyes darting to the ornate clock on the wall, a desperate attempt to escape the intensity of the moment. There are mitigating circumstances," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Mitigating circumstances for stealing my life?" Elias's voice sharpened, the controlled rage bubbling to the surface. He felt a surge of anger, hot and consuming, yet underneath it throbbed a deeper, aching pain, the pain of a lifetime of betrayal. The opulent surroundings mocked him, a stark reminder of the gilded cage he'd been trapped within. Silas cleared his throat, his voice gaining a little strength, though it still held a desperate quality. Your adoptive family, they were afraid. They believed protecting their reputation was paramount." Elias scoffed, a bitter sound that echoed in the quiet room. "My reputation? They abandoned a child, Silas. A child? How can you even begin to justify that?" He stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, the sound jarring in the tense silence. He paced, his movements restless, his energy a volatile mixture of pain and fury. The weight of his inheritance felt like a curse, not a blessing. Silas, his face paling visibly, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I understand your anger, Elias. Believe me, I do. I've lived with the consequences of my actions for decades. But it was never about malice. It was fear." Elias stopped pacing, his back to Silas. The window, a vast expanse of darkening city, mirrored the turmoil within him. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Fear? Or greed? He knew the answer, but the question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and the lingering scent of betrayal. The fight for justice had begun, and the path ahead was long and fraught with danger. But Elias, for the first time in his life, felt a fierce determination burning within him. The fight was not just for his past, but for his future, for the life he deserved. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent floral arrangements adorning Anya's office. Rain lashed against the window panes, mirroring the storm brewing inside Elias. He sat hunched, the crisp legal documents feeling like paper cuts against his skin. Each page was a fresh wound, reopening the festering sores of his past. Anya watched him, her heart aching for the young man whose life had been so cruelly stolen. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the shadows accentuating the haunted look in their depths. "It's a lot to take in," Elias finally whispered, his voice raw with emotion. He ran a hand through his hair, scattering strands across his forehead. The weight of the evidence, the sheer scale of his family's deceit, was crushing. Anya reached across the desk, her fingers brushing his. The simple gesture conveyed more comfort than any words could have. "I know, Elias, but you're not alone. We have the truth now. We have the evidence." He looked up, his gaze searching hers. A flicker of hope, a tiny ember in the ashes of his despair, ignited within him. "But what do we do with it?" He felt a tremor of fear, a chilling realization of the magnitude of what they were facing. His family, the Thorne dynasty, were not known for their kindness or generosity. Anya's expression hardened. We fight for justice, for the life you were robbed of, for your biological family, who suffered alongside you." The thought of his biological family, a family he'd never known, a family whose existence had been deliberately erased, stirred a complex mixture of emotions within him: hope, trepidation, and a deep, primal longing. He thought of the quiet, hesitant phone call, the tentative voices on the other end of the line, voices mirroring his own uncertainty and fear. He knew that this fight was not just for him. It was for them too. "They're afraid," he murmured, his gaze falling to the documents again. "Afraid of what we know." He felt the icy grip of fear tighten around his heart. The power of the Thorne family extended beyond their wealth. It stretched into the dark corners of influence and manipulation. They were formidable adversaries, and he was, essentially, alone against them. Anya squeezed his hand, her touch a grounding force amidst the rising tide of apprehension. "We won't let them intimidate us. We have the law on our side, and we have each other." Her voice, though firm, held a note of concern. She knew the risks, the potential dangers that lay ahead. But she also knew, with unwavering certainty, that this fight was worth fighting. The fight for Elias's life, for his past, and for his future, was a fight she would gladly stand beside him in, come what may. The mahogany conference table felt cold beneath Elias's trembling hands. Rain hammered against the panoramic city view, blurring the skyscrapers into indistinct gray shapes. Anya, her face etched with concern, pushed a steaming mug of chamomile tea towards him. The scent, usually calming, did little to soothe the turmoil within. "They're sending lawyers," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, the words catching in his throat. The weight of the Thorne family's impending legal assault pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of fear. Anya's hand covered his, her touch warm and reassuring. "We anticipated this, Elias. We have a strong case. Remember the medical records, the witness testimonies." He nodded, but the reassurance felt thin. The documents detailing his wrongful separation from his biological family, documents meticulously unearthed by Anya, felt like fragile paper shields against a hurricane. The memory of his mother's face, a blurry image from a childhood snatched away, intensified his apprehension. But what if they use their influence? What if they bury this before it even reaches a courtroom? The fear was palpable, a cold dread that gripped his chest. He saw his own reflection in the polished table, haggard, vulnerable. The confident young man who'd initially inherited the fortune was gone, replaced by a fighter battling not only a legal war, but the ghosts of his past. Anya squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting the storm raging outside. "We won't let them. We'll fight them on every front. We have Marcus and his family now, too. Their testimony will be crucial." The mention of Marcus, the brother he never knew he had, offered a sliver of comfort. The support of his biological family, initially tentative, had blossomed into a powerful bond. He thought of their shared trauma, their collective pain transforming into a shared resolve. Elias took a shaky breath, the chamomile tea doing little to calm the tremor in his hands. "It's more than just the money now, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about justice, about reclaiming my life." Anya's gaze held his, a silent understanding passing between them. The rain continued its relentless assault on the city, a symphony of chaos echoing the turmoil within Elias. But amidst the storm, a new resolve was taking root, a resolve fueled by the truth, strengthened by the support of his newfound family, and ignited by the unwavering love of a woman who saw beyond the wealth and the trauma to the wounded heart beneath. The fight had begun, and they would face it together. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air as Elias stared at the blueprints spread across Anya's desk. The architectural plans of the Thorne family mansion, cold and imposing even in miniature, seemed to mock him. Each meticulously drawn room represented a lifetime of calculated cruelty, a gilded cage he'd only just escaped. Anya, perched on the edge of her chair, watched him, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. "They're formidable, Elias," Anya said softly, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic hum of the hospital's ventilation system. "The Thorne legal team is legendary." Elias ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the exhaustion etched deep into his face. "Legendary for crushing anyone who dares to challenge them," he replied, his voice rough. He picked up a pencil, tracing the lines of a grand hallway, a space that held more than just architectural significance. It held memories, or rather the absence of them, a void where childhood joy should have been. "We're not just challenging them, Elias, we're exposing them." Anya's voice held a steeliness that belied her gentle nature. She pushed a file across the desk, its weight mirroring the gravity of the situation. "Marcus's testimony, along with the medical records and supporting evidence. It's more than enough to build a case. We have to be prepared for their counterattack, though." He nodded, the weight of the upcoming battle settling heavily on his shoulders. He could practically feel the cold gaze of his adoptive family, their icy disapproval piercing through the walls. Yet, a new kind of strength filled him, a strength born from the unwavering support of Anya and the rediscovered bond with his biological family. The thought of Marcus, his brother, brought a flicker of warmth into his otherwise bleak mood. "I'm afraid of what they'll do," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, the words a confession of his deepest fears. "But I'm more afraid of not fighting." The fear was still there, a gnawing anxiety, but it was overshadowed by a burning sense of justice, a fierce desire to reclaim the stolen years of his life. The fight wasn't just for his inheritance. It was for his identity, for his very existence. He would not back down. The fluorescent lights of the law firm hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm brewing inside Elias. He sat across from Mr. Fitzwilliam, a renowned litigator whose sharp eyes missed nothing. The air crackled with anticipation, the scent of old leather and expensive cologne heavy in the air. Elias felt the weight of the case, the lives hanging in the balance, pressing down on him. The Thornes' response was predictable, Fitzwilliam said, his voice a low rumble. "They're contesting everything, claiming undue influence, fabricated evidence." He pushed a thick stack of papers towards Elias, each sheet a testament to their relentless counteroffensive. Elias ran a hand over his tired eyes, the exhaustion a physical weight. He'd lost sleep, haunted by fragmented memories of his childhood, the chilling indifference of his adoptive parents. He thought of Marcus, his brother, whose testimony was the cornerstone of their case, and a fresh wave of anxiety washed over him. "They'll try to discredit Marcus, won't they?" Fitzwilliam nodded grimly. "They'll throw everything they have at him. Character assassination, financial irregularities, the works." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "We need to be prepared for a smear campaign. The media will be relentless." The fear, a cold tendril, snaked around Elias's heart. He wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for his brother, for his own fractured identity, for a future free from the shadow of his past. He felt Anya's hand, a comforting presence in the midst of the legal maelstrom, squeeze his, Her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in him, was a lifeline in the churning sea of doubt. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Then let's prepare," Elias said, his voice firmer now, though a tremor still lingered. He met Fitzwilliam's gaze, a newfound resolve hardening his expression. "Let's show them what truth can do." The weight of the fight was immense, but the fire of justice burned brighter. He would not be broken. He would fight. He had to fight. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of Anya's office, a stark contrast to the riot of emotions churning within Elias. He sat across from her, the legal documents detailing his family's deceit spread across the desk like a macabre map of betrayal. The fluorescent lights hummed, a relentless soundtrack to his anxiety. He picked at a loose thread on his trousers, the simple act of physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. "They're relentless," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the papers. The weight of the Thorne family's wealth, their influence, pressed down on him like a physical burden. Anya's hand rested on his, a silent reassurance in the face of overwhelming odds. Her touch, warm and firm, grounded him. "They are," she agreed softly, her voice a balm to his frayed nerves. "But we have evidence. Solid, irrefutable evidence. They can't ignore that." He looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and compassion, held a flicker of worry, a reflection of his own anxieties. The fear was palpable, a cold knot tightening in his chest. He felt the weight of not just his own future, but Marcus's, hanging precariously in the balance. The smear campaign had begun. Whispers and innuendo already slithered through the corridors of power. "But what if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice cracking. The vulnerability felt raw, exposing the fear that gnawed at him. The possibility of failure, of letting Marcus down, was a terrifying prospect. Anya leaned forward, her expression softening. "It is enough, Elias. We have the truth on our side. And the truth, no matter how powerful the opposition, always finds a way to prevail." She squeezed his hand, her touch conveying a strength that he desperately needed. He closed his eyes, the scent of her perfume, a blend of lavender and sandalwood, a comforting presence in the sterile environment. He saw his childhood home flash before his eyes, not the opulence he'd inherited, but a cold, empty space where love had been cruelly absent. He opened his eyes, a renewed resolve hardening his gaze. "Then let's fight," he said, his voice steadier now, infused with a newfound grit. "Let's show them what justice truly means." The fear was still there, a shadow lurking at the edges of his determination, but it no longer held him captive. He would fight. He would win. For himself, for Marcus, for the truth. He had Anya, his burgeoning love, his newfound family, and the unwavering strength of justice on his side. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the hushed urgency filling the room. Elias, his face etched with exhaustion, ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Across from him, Anya's sharp gaze, usually filled with warmth, held a steely determination. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the scent of old leather and brewing coffee doing little to mask the weight of impending legal battle. "The Thorne family's lawyers are filing a motion to dismiss," Anya stated, her voice low but firm. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He'd anticipated this, but the actual confirmation felt like a physical blow. He pushed a stray lock of hair from his eyes, the simple gesture revealing the tremor in his hand. "And?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. He could taste the bitter tang of fear on his tongue. "They're using every dirty trick in the book," Anya continued, her voice laced with anger. "Process of rebuilding his life." The courthouse steps were slick with rain, mirroring the turmoil within Elias. The crisp autumn air bit at his exposed skin, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from Anya's hand clasped in his. Eleanor, her face etched with a lifetime of sorrow, stood beside them, a fragile figure in the downpour. The victory felt hollow, the echoes of the courtroom drama still ringing in his ears. Margaret's icy silence, a final, brutal rejection, lingered like a phantom limb. "It's over," Anya murmured, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, held a weary sadness. The weight of the battle, the emotional toll it had taken on them all, was palpable. Elias squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. He looked at Eleanor, her gaze fixed on the swirling gray water cascading down the steps. He saw not just the pain of her past, but a tentative glimmer of hope. He began, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know what to do now." Eleanor's frail hand found his. "Forgive them, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Forgiveness is the only way to truly heal." Her words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply. The weight of decades of resentment seemed to lessen, replaced by a hesitant sense of peace. The rain, a relentless torrent moments before, now felt like a cleansing baptism. Anya leaned against him, her warmth a comforting presence. "There's no rush," she said softly, her voice a balm to his wounded soul. "We'll take it one step at a time. You've done what you needed to do. Now it's time to heal." He nodded, the simple gesture heavy with emotion. The inheritance, once a symbol of his family's cruelty, now felt like a tool for redemption, a means to rebuild, not just his own life, but the lives of those who had been wronged alongside him. The path ahead was still long, filled with uncertainties, but for the first time, Elias felt a profound sense of release. The gilded cage was broken, and the journey towards a life of true meaning, a life built on forgiveness and justice, had begun. The courtroom's hushed silence felt heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on Elias as the judge read the verdict. "Guilty." The word echoed in the cavernous space, a stark counterpoint to the muted sobs escaping Eleanor's lips. Anya's hand tightened in his, a silent reassurance amidst the storm of emotions. He saw his adoptive mother, Margaret, her face a mask of cold fury, her eyes glittering with unshed tears, tears not of remorse, but of rage at her exposed lies. The victory felt bittersweet, a hollow echo in the vast emptiness of his heart. Later, in the sterile calm of Anya's apartment, surrounded by the comforting scent of chamomile tea, Elias stared out at the city lights blurring into a hazy glow. The rain, a relentless torrent earlier, had subsided, leaving behind the clean, sharp smell of petrichor. "I feel empty," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the vast expanse of his newfound freedom. Anya reached across, her touch gentle, her eyes reflecting the city's shimmering lights. "The fight is over, Elias," she said softly. "But the healing, that's a different journey, a long one." Her words, though laced with understanding, couldn't penetrate the wall of numbness that had enveloped him. He had won the legal battle, but the war within raged on. The weight of his inheritance, once a symbol of his family's cruelty, now felt like a burden. He thought of Eleanor, her quiet strength a beacon in the storm of his emotions. He thought of the biological family he'd barely begun to know, their past shadowed by the same injustice that had shaped his own life. He realized that true redemption lay not in the wealth he'd acquired, but in the healing he needed to find. "I don't know how to forgive them," he finally admitted, the words heavy with unshed tears. He looked at Anya, the woman who'd stood by him through everything, her unwavering support a lifeline in the turbulent sea of his life. Anya smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "You don't have to forgive them today or tomorrow," she whispered, drawing him closer. "Forgiveness is a process, a journey, not a destination. Allow yourself the time you need to heal, to understand, to find peace within yourself. That's the true victory." Her words were a balm to his wounded soul, a promise of healing in the aftermath of a brutal fight. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Elias felt a glimmer of hope amidst the lingering shadows of the past. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the earthy aroma of the petrichor that had lingered after the storm. Elias sat by the window of Anya's apartment, the city lights a shimmering tapestry against the deepening twilight. His gaze drifted, unfocused, as he recounted the events of the trial. Margaret's face, it was horrifying, he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. The victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic win against a deeper, more insidious enemy, the wounds of his past. Anya placed a warm hand over his, her touch grounding him in the present. The legal battle is over, Elias, but the true battle lies within. She poured him more tea, the clinking of porcelain a small sound in the vastness of his emotional landscape. He accepted the cup, the warmth a small comfort against the chilling emptiness. He looked at Anya, her compassionate eyes mirroring his own turmoil. Eleanor, she's so strong. To face that, she didn't deserve any of it. The memory of Eleanor's quiet resilience, her unwavering support during the trial, tugged at his heart. Anya nodded, understanding flickering in her gaze. She's incredibly brave, Elias, and you are too. Facing your past, fighting for justice, that takes immense courage. She paused, choosing her words carefully. This isn't about retribution anymore. It's about healing, about understanding, about finding peace. He considered her words, the weight of them settling heavily in his chest. The phone rang, the sharp trill cutting through the silence. Anya answered, her voice calm and composed. A few words, then a small smile played on her lips. It's Eleanor, she announced, a hopeful note in her voice. She wants to talk. The connection with Eleanor, a small flicker of warmth in the chilling emptiness of his soul, offered a different kind of victory, one that wouldn't be found in courtrooms or legal papers, but in the quiet act of healing, in the fragile yet potent bonds of shared experience and resilience. The road ahead was long, filled with uncertainties and challenges, but for the first time, Elias felt a fragile hope blooming within the ruins of his past. He saw a path, not towards revenge, but toward a future built on understanding, forgiveness, and the enduring power of human connection. The city lights outside, once a symbol of his gilded cage, now seemed to shimmer with possibility, with a promise of the healing that lay ahead. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers, the air thick with anticipation. Elias sat rigidly, the polished mahogany of the judge's bench reflecting the stark fluorescent lights. He felt Anya's hand, a silent reassurance, squeezing his own beneath the table. His adoptive mother, Margaret Thorne, sat across the aisle, her face a mask of carefully controlled fury, her icy gaze unwavering. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed the fracture in Elias's own soul. The court finds in favor of Mr. Elias Thorne, the judge announced, his voice booming across the silent room. A wave of relief washed over Elias, but it was quickly replaced by a bitter aftertaste. The legal victory felt hollow, the triumph overshadowed by the raw wounds of his past. Later, in the quiet solitude of Anya's apartment, the city lights a blurred tapestry outside the window. Elias confessed his conflicted feelings. It's over, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. But nothing feels over. Anya, sensing his turmoil, moved closer, her touch gentle. The legal battle is won, Elias, she said softly. But the fight for peace within yourself, that continues. The aroma of brewing chamomile tea filled the air, a comforting scent amidst the storm raging inside him. He stared at the swirling steam, his gaze unfocused. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She's so brave, to face Margaret, to forgive. The sheer strength of his half-sister, discovered amidst the chaos of the trial, filled him with a strange mixture of awe and sadness. Anya's hand found his, her silent empathy a balm to his wounded spirit. She's shown immense courage, Elias, and so have you, she whispered, her voice filled with admiration. Forgiving isn't forgetting. It's choosing healing over hatred. The clinking of their mugs, the soft murmur of their voices, created a small island of peace in the vast ocean of his turmoil. The road ahead was long, challenging, and uncertain, but in Anya's steady presence, In the quiet strength of Eleanor's forgiveness, Elias found a fragile hope, a nascent understanding that true justice lay not only in legal victories, but in the healing of the heart. The courtroom's hushed silence hung heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Elias felt Anya's hand, a warm anchor in the storm of his emotions. He glanced at Eleanor, his half-sister, her face pale but resolute. The weight of their shared history pressed down, a tangible thing. Margaret Thorne, his adoptive mother, remained a glacial statue, her expensive suit a stark contrast to the turmoil within. The judge's pronouncements echoed, each word a hammer blow against the carefully constructed facade of the Thorne family. Guilty, on all counts. A ripple of gasps snaked through the courtroom. But for Elias, the victory felt less like triumph and more like a hollow ache. The legal battle was won, but the war within raged on. Later, in the sterile, bright-lit hospital room where Eleanor lay recovering from the emotional toll of the trial, a single vase of lilies offered a fragile counterpoint to the sterile environment. Their scent, sharp and sweet, mingled with the antiseptic tang of the air. Elias sat beside her bed, watching her sleep. The lines of exhaustion etched on her face spoke volumes. "She's strong," Anya whispered, her hand resting gently on his. The city lights painted streaks of color across the window, mirroring the conflicted emotions swirling within him. He nodded, his throat tight. But she shouldn't have had to be. The anger, long suppressed, threatened to boil over. He thought of the years of silence, the deliberate cruelty, the systematic erasure of his existence. Anya squeezed his hand. "It's not your fault, Elias." Her voice, a soft counterpoint to the storm within him, offered solace. "You didn't deserve any of this." He looked at Eleanor's sleeping face, her vulnerability a stark reminder of the shared trauma that bound them. The quiet strength she'd shown in court, the quiet forgiveness she offered, was a testament to her resilience. And it shamed him. His own rage felt small, insignificant beside her quiet dignity. The scent of chamomile tea, a familiar comfort, drifted from the thermos Anya held. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through him, a tiny spark against the lingering chill of betrayal. I don't know what comes next," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The path to forgiveness, to healing, seemed impossibly long and arduous. Anya smiled, a gentle understanding in her eyes. "One step at a time, Elias. We'll face it together." Her hand found his again, her touch a promise of unwavering support. The weight of the past remained, heavy and inescapable, but in the quiet strength of their connection, a fragile hope began to bloom. The fight for justice was over. The fight for peace had just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the bouquet of lilies Eleanor's aunt had sent. Elias traced the delicate petals, their vibrant color a fragile beacon in the gloom of the hospital room. Eleanor stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Eleanor offered a weak smile. "Exhausted, but better." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights shimmered like fallen stars. "It's over, isn't it?" Elias nodded, the weight of the past pressing down on him. The victory felt hollow, the legal battle won, but the scars remained. "The trial, it changed everything," he whispered, his voice catching. He felt Anya's presence beside him, her hand a silent reassurance on his arm. "It exposed the truth," Anya said softly, her voice a calm counterpoint to the turmoil within him. "And that's a powerful thing." Eleanor looked at them both, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "I never knew the extent of it all. The lies, the cruelty." She paused, her voice trembling. "I still don't understand why they did it." The question hung in the air, unanswered, a stark reminder of the family's incomprehensible actions. Elias felt a surge of anger, a bitter taste in his mouth. Years of rejection, of feeling like an outsider, welled up within him. He squeezed Eleanor's hand, his knuckles white, We'll never truly understand it, will we? Anya placed a comforting hand on his back. But we have each other, she said, her voice a warm balm against the lingering chill of betrayal. And that's what matters now. The city lights outside continued their silent vigil, a backdrop to their unspoken understanding. The fight for justice was over. The arduous journey towards healing and forgiveness had just begun. The future, though uncertain, held the fragile promise of a new dawn. The courtroom's hushed silence felt heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on Elias. The scent of old wood and polished brass mingled with the nervous sweat of the onlookers. His adoptive mother, a woman he barely recognized, sat stiffly, her face a mask of controlled fury. Across from her, Eleanor, his biological sister, clutched a tissue, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The judge's gavel, a symbol of finality, lay poised on the mahogany bench. "Your Honor," Elias began, his voice clear despite the tremor in his hands. The words, rehearsed countless times, still felt raw, each syllable a painful excavation of buried memories. He spoke of abandonment, of the deliberate lies, of the cold indifference that had shaped his childhood. His voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger, fueled by a righteous anger that burned away the years of self-doubt. He described the forged documents, the manipulated medical records, the carefully constructed facade of a loving family. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Anya watched him from the gallery, her heart aching with both pride and fear. The intensity of his testimony, the raw emotion pouring from him, left her breathless. She saw the years of hurt, the battle scars etched onto his soul, yet also the burgeoning strength, the unwavering resolve. Silas Blackwood, fidgeting in the defendant's seat, avoided eye contact. His usually impeccable composure had crumbled, revealing a man broken by the weight of his deceit. His guilt was palpable, a suffocating blanket in the tense courtroom. As Elias concluded, a wave of emotion swept through the room. Eleanor wept openly, a cathartic release of years of pain. The judge's expression was unreadable, yet Elias felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a subtle acknowledgement of the truth. The weight of the past, the burden of lies, had finally been lifted. The fight for justice wasn't yet over, but the first battle had been won. The battle for healing and forgiveness, however, had only just begun. The future, though uncertain, held the promise of a new dawn. But for now, this moment, this fragile victory, was enough. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat. Elias, his face pale but resolute, watched his adoptive father, a man who had never once looked at him with genuine warmth, shift uncomfortably in the witness stand. His testimony, delivered earlier, had hung in the air, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed lies his family had woven over decades. "Your Honor," Elias's adoptive father, Arthur Thorne, began, his voice a shaky tremor against the silence. I can only say that I believed I was acting in Elias's best interests." His words, laced with self-justification, felt hollow even to his own ears. He glanced at Elias, a flicker of something akin to regret crossing his features, quickly masked by a return to his defensive posture. Anya, watching from the gallery, saw the subtle shift in his demeanor. The carefully crafted mask of wealth and privilege was cracking, revealing the fragile man beneath. The weight of his actions, the truth exposed, was visibly crushing him. She squeezed Elias's hand reassuringly during a brief recess, her touch a silent affirmation of her unwavering support. Elias, during the break, found his biological mother, Eleanor, her eyes red-rimmed but filled with a newfound strength. "It's been difficult," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "But seeing you here, fighting for yourself, it's given me strength I didn't know I had."